Hi, welcome to the virtual tour of Summit County Workforce and Affordable Housing. Summit County has been working on the challenges of providing and maintaining affordable housing for many years. Over time, strategies have evolved and today include deed-restricted housing, funding through sales tax initiatives, and the creation of a multi-jurisdictional housing authority. Throughout this tour, we will meet several different people working on affordable housing in Summit County and learn about different developments providing housing options for local residents. We'll talk with representatives from the Summit Combined Housing Authority, the Town of Breckenridge, the Summit County Housing Department, and Brynn Gray Partners. To begin, we'll start with Amy Pregel, the Executive Director of the Summit Combined Housing Authority. I know there's a lot going on in Summit County. There are a lot of different entities working to bring workforce housing in. Can you describe a little bit about what the role of the Summit Combined Housing Authority is in that landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. Our focus tends to be a little bit more of a consultancy role throughout the process, whether that's to the jurisdictions, to the developers, to potential funding partners, et cetera. We'll consult with them. We'll tell them, hey, this is what we're seeing in other developments. This is feedback we're getting from owners. This is best practices we've noticed. These are some things that folks said that they wish they would have done differently. And we'll serve in that consultancy role on the development side, but not actually doing the development. And then our other main focus is really driven by community outreach and education. So we do a lot directly with the community through our organization, whether that's working on our updated needs update that we just finished last summer. We did a lot of forums, we did a lot of surveys, reaching out to people in deed restricted housing, our local workforce, local employers, people who live here and commute in from other counties like Lake County, Grand County, Park County, Clear Creek County. We'll do a lot of outreach like that. And then a lot of our program areas also focus on that community outreach. So we do home buyer education, and that's for anybody. They don't have to be in the deed restricted ownership or rental world to take advantage of that. We'll do one-on-one financial counseling with people if they're looking to improve their credit because maybe down the road they want to buy a home. We do down payment assistance loan programs for properties in Summit County for our local workers. And again, that doesn't have to be restricted to the deed restricted world. It could be just any property located in Summit County as long as the actual applicant fulfills the program requirements. We also deal in real estate for the ownership properties. So right now we mainly deal with the new developments. So if the town or the county is developing a property, a lot of times we will step in as the transaction broker for those properties because we do have 2 licensed realtors on staff. We also do monitoring and compliance work with the jurisdictions.
Great. That's a really wonderful description. Thank you so much for that. Just a little bit more in that world for all of those different programs and different ways that you work in Summit County. How is all of that work funded?
So we are at the Summit Combined Housing Authority sales tax funded. We have a couple of different sales taxes. The first is we collect a 0.125% sales and use tax. We are really, really fortunate because our voters back in 2015 elected that to continue in perpetuity. We're also very, very lucky at the Summit Combined Housing Authority that in 2016, our community also supported an additional 0.6% sales tax for 10 years beginning in 2017. So we started collecting that in 2017, and that's going to sunset for us in 2026 unless it's brought back to the voters at that time. There is another funding mechanism through one of those ballot measures. We just don't deal with that directly at the Summit Combined Housing Authority. And that allows each individual jurisdiction to assess a development impact fee of up to $2 a square foot. They do that directly. We're not involved in that setting the fee or collection of the fees, so we don't have that information, but that is another funding source.
For the uses for the sales tax and the impact fees, what are the parameters? What are the jurisdictions held to in terms of what those funds can be used for?
Yeah, so that always obviously is going to revert back to the ballot language because we want to be sure we're using the funds as they were intended when our voters gave us that support. The 0.125% sales and use tax is actually very, very broad. That ballot language basically just said for affordable housing purposes, full stop. So there is a lot of leeway in there. They could use it for development, obviously. I know some jurisdictions are looking at, could we use that potentially for employee down payment assistance loan programs, things like that. I know we've gotten funding back from the jurisdictions for some of our down payment assistance loan programs. So that one is, again, the ballot language was just very, very broad on that. The 0.6% is a little bit more restrictive in that it was intended for Summit County workers to either be able to move into or remain living in Summit County. So that one does set a little bit more of a geographical limit for that 0.6%. But again, beyond that, it's written pretty much just for affordable housing purposes. So there's a lot of flexibility, which is great because then we're able to pick up on new ideas and potentially course correct and change strategies as times change over the years.
Finally, do you have any recommendations for a community that's trying to enable more workforce housing?
I always like to say from, again, the Housing Authority's perspective, when we're in the initial phases, nothing's really off the table for brainstorming. All of the ideas won't pan out, but sometimes they'll lead you to ideas that you never would have otherwise thought of.
Can you sort of walk us through the Gibson Heights project a little bit and tell us about that project?
I can, and actually one interesting thing about this project is it actually predates the Summit Combined Housing Authority as an organization even. It was built back in 2004 by the town of Breckenridge. There are 40 units in the property. It's a mix of townhomes and then single family homes and duplexes. It does need to be owner occupied, and it was targeting 80% area median income households. So that is great for us from the Housing Authority perspective because needs change over time, but the one need we have seen consistently is that the lower you go on the income scale, the greater the need is for housing and the more difficult it is to make that happen. So when we can get these 80% or below units, we're always thrilled to have those. And as I mentioned before, make sure we're still keeping them used as intended through the monitoring and compliance process as well. The town also did a great job, as they do in all of their developments and the other towns in the county do with their developments, on trying to look beyond just the sticks and bricks of the housing and including neighborhood amenities. For example, it's on the rec path, it's got easy access to trails, there's public transit to it. Just really trying to make it feel like a community instead of just, hey, here's a cheap house you can have. Because that is one thing in our last needs update that people really liked and they really wanted to keep seeing, was that community feel, even if it's in a smaller development than a 40-unit development. As far as the restrictions on the property, all owners are required, as I mentioned, to make this their primary residence. At least one person in the household does have to work 30 hours a week within Summit County. You can't own other property. So, they don't want, and by they, I mean the town, when they were initially setting the goals for the property, they didn't want this to be, for lack of a better term, a cheap alternative for someone who could afford and maybe does have another property. They really wanted to provide this for folks who didn't have other options available to them at that time. To keep it affordable, there is an appreciation limit on the sale of the property. So owners can get appreciation of the lesser of either 3% per year, or we'll look at the change in their area median income from the day they purchased until the day they sold. So that is a mechanism that the town built in to make sure it wasn't, again, initially priced at that 80% area median income and then quickly skyrocketed it into 100%, 100% plus and got away from that initial goal. And then the last big thing about this neighborhood that is pretty standard through a lot of our neighborhoods is on the rental side. So short-term rentals are prohibited. They've always been prohibited, whether they had been licensed by the town of Breckenridge or not. The licensing process, again, is nice because that gives us another means to track and monitor that, other than just taking people's word for it or trying to see if it was on VRBO or Airbnb in the olden days. But with that said, owners are always allowed to rent rooms within their units too. So if I owned a unit in Gibson Heights and I had a friend who was a local Summit County worker, I could rent a room in my unit to that person as well and get even more workforce into that unit. The only requirement is, again, any roommates would also just have to meet that 30-hour-a-week work requirement.
Next, we'll talk with Lori Best, a planner with the town of Breckenridge who has a lot of experience and insight into how the town thinks of workforce housing.
You know, the town of Breckenridge is really committed to making sure that we provide housing for our workforce. And in a way, it's viewed as important as any other kind of basic infrastructure for a community. It's as important as our roads and our water lines and our sewer lines, that we can house the people that are working in town and serving our visitors and serving our locals, that they can live in the town where they work.
Great. And can you share with us a little bit about how the policies and zoning in Breckenridge have worked either to advance workforce housing or maybe have gotten in the way of workforce housing?
Well, let's start with the way they've gotten, the manner in which they've gotten in the way. You know, in Breckenridge, we've gone through a couple different iterations of our development code policies. The development code policies are, you know, the policies that would apply to new construction, new development. You know, what portion of their employees, if any, do they have to provide for? And unfortunately, in the town of Breckenridge, it took us a couple decades to get to a point where we were asking employers, builders and employers to contribute to workforce housing and to mitigate a certain percentage of the workforce to jobs that they were going to be creating by that certain development. So it's been very recent that we changed our development code to include a sort of commercial linkage requirement, where if you're building a new store, you're going to generate a certain number of employees. And effective with the application of this new code, which is just within a year we adopted this, you now would have to provide and mitigate at least 30% of the employees that are being generated by that new development. And you can do some of them on site, you can do some of them off site. So that's going to help us a lot in terms of sort of the keep up need as new construction and new development occurs. It's nice to be able to keep up with the employee generation that's created by that new development. You know, you need different strategies for catching up if you're already way behind. But in terms of a keep up strategy, having something that shifts some share of the responsibility to the private sector is super important. Because, you know, we don't think that the obligation to provide housing should fall solely on the municipality or the public sector. The private sector should certainly share in that. And we think businesses need to recognize that if they're going to be successful, they're going to have to figure ways to account for their employees as part of their basic business plan. We were hurt for a long time when we didn't have a sort of requirement on new development. You know, some of the policies that have really helped us and have been really effective, and I don't know if these are going to be applicable to other municipalities or other jurisdictions, but for us, our annexation policy has probably been our #1 tool in terms of generating housing units for our locals. In any annexation situation, we require a minimum of 80% of the units that are coming in through that annexation to be deed restricted for locals. So that's you know, you can get 20% market rate units to make your project pencil, but you're going to have to provide 80% of your units for locals. So the annexation policy is super strict and super effective. Most of our big new neighborhoods were a result of the annexation policy. You know, we also frequently use development agreements with people. If somebody has a piece of property and they just can't make a affordable housing project pencil, either because of a code issue, you know, they need 3 stories and it's a 2-story zone district, or they just don't quite have enough density. You know, we have the ability to negotiate through, it's called a development agreement. It allows us to sort of wave a magic wand on some of the policies that might have prohibited that project from working out. So we've used that a few times. If a project was slightly over height or couldn't quite meet a setback, we would have the town council approve a development agreement, which is really just a negotiation with that private sector partner. And, they get a little bit of a concession and we get public benefit of housing. So I would say, the tools that have been most effective: annexation agreements, development agreements, and then now we expect our new development code to help us as well with especially with the keeping up.
Great. And can you talk a little bit about the performance-based code in Breckenridge and how that interfaces with workforce housing?
Yeah, it's interesting. Our code is unlike other Euclidean zoning where, you have a commercial zone district and the only thing you can do is commercial. We have a zoning that is a flexible zoning system, and in most zone districts you can do almost any use. It's a flexible, but it's point based. So you have to do enough really good things and get a lot of positive points for the good things to mitigate anything that might be perceived as a bad thing. So, we use that quite a bit. That's how we evaluate all new development, is you basically have to get a score of 0. And, it does, having the flexibility in our code does enable the private sector to use a parcel for housing that could also be used for commercial. But by incentivizing the housing and giving more points for housing, you can get an easier positive point analysis. And actually, like the ski area housing, which is, I think it's about 180 units, Breck Terrace, without a flexible zoning system probably could have never happened there, because it's more of a commercial area out there. But we were able to use the flexible zoning to sort of accommodate a sort of skier employee housing project out there. One of our biggest challenges, obviously, in providing housing and employee housing isn't because of new jobs. It's because we're losing so much of the housing that historically served our workforce. And so we're losing it to short-term rental, or we're losing it to retirees. And it's housing that already exists and that at one time did serve our workforce. And so we were, the issue of being able to retain some of that existing inventory that's out there. You don't have to build a new unit if you've got one out there that historically served the workforce, and somehow you can keep that available to locals. It's really, really hard with, real estate appreciation, and people are like, I've been holding onto my house and it's my retirement. I need to sell. I don't necessarily want to sell it to a short-term renter or to an out-of-towner, but I need my earnings out of it. And so the Housing Helps program can really help, because what we do is we will pay owners to accept a deed restriction on their property. And it's super helpful in terms of people that own houses already that are not deed restricted, but they could serve our workforce because they're in that kind of price point where, yes, a local could afford this. And so we pay people to accept a deed restriction on their property. Is cheaper than us building new housing, replacement housing for housing we're losing. And, that way, you don't have the issue about more density, because the house has been here forever. And all we're doing is making sure that the occupant in that house is somebody working locally, and it doesn't just convert to a short-term rental or a retirement home. So yeah, Housing Helps has been particularly helpful to us. It's used by people that currently own their property, and they're either thinking about selling, or they need improvements or maintenance or upkeep, because a lot of our housing stock is up there. So a lot of times they'll accept a deed restriction on their property. They can use the proceeds from that deed restriction to repair their house, make it more livable, get through a special assessment, because a lot of our condo complexes are getting kind of old, and it's hard for, a lot of times the locals are forced out because they just can't pay the special assessment. So, it helps in that situation. Housing Helps can also be used by somebody that wants to buy a unit and they don't have enough down payment. So we will, they can buy a market rate unit. We will pay them proceeds to put a deed restriction on it. And at closing, they get the funds, the proceeds from the deed restriction, and we get the deed restriction on the unit. So, it can be used by existing owner or somebody that wants to buy a unit, but it's all about preserving that existing inventory that historically served the workforce. So that's just one example of a program that we're using.
So the deed restrictions on the properties, in addition to sort of restricting people who work in county, does it also put a cap on the resale value?
It's interesting because we have, not probably as bad as some other communities, but we have a variety of different levels of deed restriction. And, if it's a neighborhood, and say it was part of an annexation agreement, it's probably going to have our most strict deed restriction. And, the strictest deed restriction is going to have an appreciation cap. It'll probably have an owner occupancy restriction. It'll have limitations on ownership of other property and things. So that's probably our strictest deed restriction. Might even have an income cap to be able to purchase it. But for housing helps and for some of the other dispersed units, we have a deed restriction light. And it's really just an occupancy restriction. Whoever is occupying that unit has to be working locally. It can be the owner. It can be a tenant, and so housing helps in a way is also spurring just local investment in workforce housing, because an investor can buy 5 units. And if they'll put deed restrictions on all 5 units, they'll get the proceeds from the deed restrictions on all 5 units. It's a deed restriction light, only requires that the occupant be working locally. So different levels of deed restriction based on the whether it's in a neighborhood, a for sale neighborhood, or is it in town. But I think it is important to be flexible and have different levels of restriction that you use in different circumstances.
Yeah. And then specifically for the Housing Helps program, how is it determined, or how much do you pay for someone to put a deed restriction on their property?
Yeah. Well, we are trying, nobody really understands or can predict the impact of that deed restriction on the value when you go to sell. So, if that unit is a $400,000 market rate unit with no restriction, you put a occupancy deed restriction light on it, what is going to be the value of that down the road? And a lot of it's going to depend on how long they own it, and what the market is when they go to sell. So we don't know yet, because we haven't been in this long enough to sort of see some resales. But we are willing to pay 15% of the market value of the house. So $400,000 market rate, we would pay 15% of $400,000 for you to put a deed restriction on that house. The town of Vail's actually been doing housing helps under a different name for a little bit longer. And so they have actually seen some sales. And, in talking with some of the appraisers and the realtors over there, they believe that probably the impact of that deed restriction might be closer to 7% or something. So, 15%, we want to make sure we compensate you adequately. We don't want somebody down the road saying, oh my God, it was a terrible deal. So I think we feel comfortable that 15% is a good number. It's going to, we think, cover whatever the value is diminished. And it's still a lot less than if we have to go out and get land, build a brand new unit. And so from our perspective, it's an efficient use of our funds, an efficient way to get deed restricted units at a sort of lesser cost per deed restriction.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the Moose Landing development?
Yeah, Moose Landing is a fairly recent one. I think we did that in 2018-ish. And it was an interesting one. The town owned a sort of a sliver parcel. It was really a remnant parcel. And we had looked at it and tried to figure out what we could do to utilize it for some sort of housing, but it was pretty small and irregular in shape. And I think we looked at it, we could maybe get 4 townhomes on there. And then the neighbor, a local private a builder in Breckenridge, owned a parcel adjacent to ours and approached us and basically asked if the town would contribute our sliver of land, which would make his parcel a more reasonable size and better access to the road. if we would contribute our parcel to his parcel, and then he would do a development on the combined parcel. And so for us, it was almost a no-brainer, since the remnant parcel didn't mean too much to us. But because we were providing a piece of the land, we had the ability to negotiate with him in terms of what the product would be. And so, it's really super cool apartments. It's rental. Half of them are targeting 80% AMI, and the other half just have a no short-term rental provision on them. So all in all, it's where local workforce is living, and it's really nice construction, super cool units, great location. And really, it was not much out of the town's pocket other than a remnant parcel that we really didn't have a good plan for. So yeah, that one worked out really well. Came online a year and a half or 2 years ago, and fully leased up. What made it sort of even more compelling for the builder was that he could get master leases with some of the big businesses here. So he had his apartments all booked with master leases before he even broke ground. Alta Verde is a great one. It is, we're in the planning stages right now, and Alta Verde is on a piece of land that the town owned, and we've owned it forever. It was, at one point it was viewed as way out of town, but now it's not. I think we got the land back, well, probably even before I joined the town, so more than 20 years ago. And so we have a little parcel out there, 4 acres, that was designated for housing. And what we did is we actually put a RFP out on that one and said, town owns a piece of property. We'd like to, partner with a developer that will do a project. And we ended up selecting a partner, and they submitted for 9% LIHTC on that. And so they were approved for 9% low income tax credits for Alta Verde. So it's 80 units. It's a combination of 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms. We will be hitting, 30% AMI on that project. And that's really because of the LIHTC funding. The LIHTC funding is bringing a lot of equity to the property or to the project. And I think it's about a $23 million project, and the LIHTC is bringing about $9 million. And then the rest of it is just stacked with some other financing sources. But the town's role in that is really provide the 4 acres. And then our partner on that is charged with actually doing the development, owning the project. We're going to do a land lease. And they're responsible for, the ongoing reporting on the LIHTC and just oversight and property management. So for us, that's kind of a win-win, because, once you build the apartments, you do need to decide, are you going to own them and manage them, or is somebody else going to own them and manage them? And so for us, Alta Verde is going to be really exciting. The other super, super cool thing with Alta Verde is we were able to get a grant from DOLA that's going to help us go net zero. So it's net zero, 80%, or really low AMIs. Our lowest is 30% AMI, super low AMI, and net zero.
The Summit County Housing Department is very focused on preserving and creating workforce housing in the county. To share about that work, we have Jason Dietz, the housing director for Summit County.
Back in 2016, Summit County started the housing department for the first time to deal with workforce housing projects and preservation. For many decades, workforce housing and attainable housing has been an issue in Summit County, along with many other mountain communities. So the housing department, our primary objective is to preserve existing workforce housing, whether that be in existing traditional historic workforce neighborhoods or development of new workforce housing projects.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Dillon Valley Vistas, sort of the same thing in terms of what the project is and how it's come together and why it's exciting.
Yeah, so Dillon Valley Vistas is a really cool project that we have right now that's being constructed right now. And when did we buy that? We bought that back in 2012, kind of coming out of the recession. And the county didn't quite know what they wanted to do with it, but they knew that they wanted to secure the land, for future, for land banking for future workforce housing. So, as we looked at the project, and the county looked at the project, originally I think we were thinking that we would probably do a little bit higher density, but in working with the neighborhood, talking to the local sewer district and water district, it definitely made the most sense to do duplexes. And then also getting feedback from the most recent housing needs assessment, and then just looking at the number of sewer taps and water taps that are available, without doing a whole bunch of upgrading. We landed on a duplex, a 12-unit duplex site, and one plus, I should say, not and, but plus one lot we are donating to Habitat for Humanity for them to build a habitat house and reach a lower AMI. The duplexes, they are going to be 3 and 4 bedroom units that are kind of geared towards larger households, a little bit higher square footage than what you typically find in a lot of workforce housing. Those units are typically fairly, there's not a lot of them in most housing developments, and they are usually at the 120% AMI. Very few are priced at 100% AMI. So we are pricing all of them at 100% AMI. Additionally, this project, which one of the things that we really like about it is that it's going to be a net zero energy ready project and have solar on all of the units. And one unit is going to be pure net zero. And we're going to be using some different technology on that as a prototype to see how it works in this environment, to maybe use in different projects like Lake Hill. So all of the units are going to be extremely energy efficient, and probably basically not have an electric bill and a very low gas bill because of the the high efficiency boiler and then also the upgraded insulation packages. So we're really excited to get Dillon Valley Vistas kicked off and built. We have our first 2 foundations poured, and we should be starting framing here in the next week or so.
Nice. And when do you expect them to be move-in ready?
We expect to have the first 2 units probably by the end of the year. So it's the COVID construction protocols, have really kind of delayed the build process probably by about 50%. And before we were going to be in 4 months from start to finish. Now it's about 6 months from start to finish. So there is a little bit of a delay in the construction cycle. But we expect to have the entire project built out by July of next year, 2021.
As we have seen, there's a lot of capacity between the cities, the county, and the housing authorities, but it's also key to acknowledge the developers who focus on workforce and affordable housing. Our last expert is Melissa Sherburne, Vice President of Development at Brynn Partners and resident of the Peak One neighborhood in Frisco.
We are based in Frisco, Colorado, Summit County. And we are well known for our workforce housing developments in Summit County and other areas of Colorado. And so one of our sort of flagship projects is Peak One neighborhood, where I happen to live. And we're also known for the Wellington neighborhood in Breckenridge, and as well as Base Camp Shops and Residences, which is near Whole Foods in Frisco. Actually, Whole Foods Base Camp is the entire development. We have a number of other developments, West Steamboat neighborhoods in Steamboat, and some others in the hopper. So I oversee entitlements, planning, community outreach, everything that goes into sort of the pre-development work that we do.
So you mentioned Peak One. Can you tell us a little bit about the Peak One project?
Sure. So Peak One neighborhood is a workforce housing development in Frisco, Colorado. It consists of 69 homes, mostly single family, some duplex, between AMI categories of around 80 to 150% AMI. And beyond. There are some 20% of the development are actually market homes as well. Peak One was developed, as all of our neighborhoods are, in a traditional neighborhood development form. And so what that really means is modeled after a traditional neighborhood that you would find in older cities and towns across America. So Boulder, Colorado, any town with a small, quaint, walkable downtown neighborhood feel. And so what that translates to is we've got front porches, we've got sidewalks, we've got alleyways with detached garages. And so it really creates a beautiful sense of place, very, very livable, which really is incredibly important to any neighborhood, especially a year-round workforce neighborhood like Pequon. And I saw this development through, before I was a member of the development team, I was fortunate to sort of see it come to life as a development in Frisco. And it truly was a unique public-private partnership in that the town had the initiative many years ago to participate in a land swap with the U.S. Forest Service to dedicate this land to eventually workforce housing. And so the firm that I now work for, Brynn Gray Partners, won the competitive process to develop the land. It's roughly about 12 acres to construct a neighborhood. At that point, Wellington had been well underway, and so that was a great template. Pequon is really unique. It's got the Frisco look, and so the colors and some of the patterns and materials are sort of uniquely Frisco, mining town, sort of reminiscent of that. And so it really took a lot of leadership on the town's part to put such an outstandingly beautiful parcel towards workforce housing. If you had the chance to come and visit, we're right on the bike path. We're right on the National Forest. We're 4 blocks to downtown. And so it's an incredibly beautiful and valuable piece of land. Definitely a partnership. Definitely the town worked with us to achieve the result that we got.
Are there deed restrictions on the properties? And if so, how are they structured?
Yes, so there are. So the entire neighborhood has deed restrictions. 80% of them have a sort of the full deed restriction. And so what that means is there's an appreciation cap of 3% annually. There is a work requirement. So a member of the household has to be working within Summit County. Let's see what else. Those are the 2 main ones. Then 20% of the homes are what we call market homes. And the market homes, they're not full market homes, but they do not have the appreciation cap, but you still have to be a member of the Summit County workforce. So the outcome of that is something that I think really makes for a vibrant neighborhood, and that is we have members of the workforce from across the spectrum, from healthcare to business owners to teachers to attorneys. I mean, it really spans the workforce here in Frisco, and so I think it does a really good job of that.
Were there any challenges on the project that you've learned from that you would share those learnings for people going forward?
You know, there was some stakeholder concerns. There was neighbors that didn't want to see before the neighborhood, it was a park, and there was social trails that went through the neighborhood. And so instead of sort of fighting against the current there, the design and architecture team embraced that feedback, and a lot of the trails that are now formalized in the neighborhood through pathways and walking trails, those were actually the social trails of the neighborhood. And so it really was a goal to integrate well into the existing fabric of Frisco. And ultimately, you know, I think you wouldn't believe, you know, just sitting on my front porch, hearing people walk by and say, oh my gosh, how can we live here? You know, it's a really, I think everybody would agree, it's a fantastic neighborhood. And so a lot of that stuff is sort of NIMBYism is very much expected, but it's great to end up with a product that is so embraced by our community. So we're really proud of that.
That's it for our tour of Summit County Affordable Workforce Housing. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully it offered some ideas to support more affordable housing in your community.